both a good dose of atheism and a good atheist challenge. But I think at the end of the day, this anti-theistic stance can somehow obscure the rather more straightforward meaning of the term atheism, simply that it is a way of thinking that does not include and has no time for the idea of theos. And I think Buddhism and Taoism would be another example, are traditions that have lived perfectly happily for hundreds of years and have produced as many great thinkers and philosophers and saints as the theistic religions, and yet they haven't had any need to have recourse to the idea of God. Now, this undermines, I think, what a lot of theists will say, namely that you cannot lead a good, moral, just life unless those values are underpinned in some way by some transcendent deity or God in whom goodness and truth and beauty are somehow located. Now, I think a lot of people in our world today hold some variant of that kind of view, and yet it flies in the face of the evidence, the ample evidence, that you do not need to hold such beliefs or have such faith in order to live a good life, because there is plenty of people throughout history who have done exactly that, minus any belief in God.
Would you say that, and this is something that I draw from this book and other things you've said, tell me if I'm right or wrong about it, but would you say that the more absolutes we posit and kind of install in our worldview, the more gods we decide must be real, the more cycles of rebirth we decide must be real, or the more gods we decide must be unreal, for example, that all makes existence less interesting?
It's difficult to say. It's difficult to generalize because, certainly there are people who have a very deep faith in God and yet at the same time are very passionately concerned with the issues of this world. They would even argue that it's their belief in God that sustains them in their work with the poor and the disadvantaged and the search for justice and so on. There are great artists and visionaries and poets who have also gained enormously from their beliefs in God. So I don't think one can generalize. I can certainly say for myself that I've never found those sorts of ideas remotely attractive. And I do feel, in accordance with what you were suggesting, that to place too great a part of one's attention on something which is outside the realm of what we can readily apprehend and know about is, I think, likely to turn our attention away from the concerns of this world. I feel many things that Buddhism has to say, as do indeed many other traditions, is that the fullness of our human life is not really to be gained by positing something outside of this world that we can only really have some sort of trust or confidence in, but the human life is lived most fully when we're able to put those ideas aside and concentrate far more on the actual world of our sensory experience, of our emotional experience, of a greater sensitivity and empathy for the suffering of other persons, other forms of life on this planet, and to seek to find a way of life in which we respond as completely as we humanly can to the needs that our world here and now are calling out to be addressed. And I feel in that regard, theistic beliefs and absolutist beliefs of any kind can probably get in the way.
This greater sense experience there is to be had, that concept of enriching your own experience of the world, that seemed to be what, correct me if I'm wrong, but that seemed to be what drew you to Buddhism in your youth initially, am I right?
Yes, I would say that has been a very consistent part of my own involvement with Buddhism. And probably one of the reasons I was attracted to it was because it seemed to offer a methodology, which I think is, for many people, a very attractive aspect of Buddhism. It gives you something to do, something to test out in your own life. And what I found of most value in Buddhist practices are precisely those forms of meditation and philosophy that illuminate my world, that somehow open up aspects of experience that I had never noticed before. That there's a sense of intensification, a sense of richness, a sense of depth that comes from these practices. and these ideas. And I think that is within a continuum of my own rather juvenile experiments with psychedelic drugs and other such things when I was a teenager. And I think Buddhism provided a set of tools that was able to take that very immature inquiry to much greater depths.
In the book, you have this line that I quite like. You write about, I believe, the explosion of the interest in Buddhism resulting from the collision of Tibet and the 1960s. Now, what does that mean specifically?
What it means specifically is that there was a period of years, and I would say that probably ran from about 1966, the mid-1960s, through to, say, the mid to late 1970s, where suddenly you had a significant number of educated and sincere young people from America, from Europe, from Australasia, who all headed off towards Asia. And then you had 100,000 Tibetans following the Dalai Lama out of Chinese-occupied Tibet at around the same time, or a little bit before. And these two groups of people, both fleeing in their own ways from different forms of oppression, perceived or real, and driven likewise by, I think, a fascination and a curiosity about one another. The Tibetans needed us, I think, as much as we thought we needed them. They needed connections in the world outside of India, in which they could make their message known, in which they could teach their culture and so forth and so on. And we were people desperately looking for some way out of the impasse that we had probably got ourselves into, but was certainly, I think, a common feature of that period, where there really was a sense that militaristic, global capitalism, particularly those periods with the Vietnam War. We have all kinds of turmoil and local conflicts going on in the world, or rather arrogant governments in the Western countries, the nuclear armaments and so on. We were looking for something else. We were looking for another culture. We'd lost faith in our ancestral religions of Judaism, of Christianity and so on. And here suddenly we bump into these extraordinary men, mainly men, in these Tibetan communities in refugee camps in India. And we find something that seems to be responding to some of the deeper questions in our own lives. And I think that was a kind of collision in the sense that it wasn't intended by either party. It was somewhat accidental. And I think the other reason I chose that metaphor, I said we were like particles colliding in an accelerator. And if you think of that image, you have these pictures, at least, of these collisions in which there are consequences that we can't predict. In other words, you have all sorts of spin-offs, all sorts of results from that impact that go off in all sorts of strange ways. And I think that is fair to say has in fact happened in the last 30 or so years, where the encounter between, let's say, the hippie generation and the Tibetans, or more broadly speaking, the encounter between Western and Buddhist cultures, has generated a quite extraordinary and rather sometimes slightly bizarre consequence of meetings and ideas and different influences in music and literature and the arts and movies and whatnot, and also because quite clearly affected the lives of millions of people. And the ramifications of that are impossible to foresee, but it's now something that's certainly happening in our world. Buddhism is no longer a rather occult pastime of old 1960s types people, but it is being now practiced and embraced by people right through the social spectrum. It's no longer something that people don't know much about. It's well broadcast. There are numerous books, magazines, audios, podcasts, TV shows, etc., all of which help give more information and knowledge about this culture. So clearly something has happened, and I feel fortunate in a way to have been of that generation that made those first contacts back in the early 1970s.
And speaking of your own story, which is vividly told in the book, but you of course didn't just adopt some Buddhist principles and return to life. You went the whole way. You became a monk in several different traditions. And what in your life prompted you to go that far with it, to go as far as one can go with adopting Buddhism? I mean, today somebody will convert to Buddhism and they won't be donning a robe, certainly. What had you take those extra many steps?
Well, I think to some extent it was circumstantial. In other words, I was privileged enough to have a certain amount of money in a trust fund that I could use to pursue my studies. I was idealistic enough coming out of the late 60s to really believe that some kind of radical transformation of the mind and the world was possible. And I was also very moved and very inspired by Tibetan monks and Zen teachers and so on, who quite clearly had put these teachings into practice and, from what I could tell, had achieved significant results in their own lives from having done so. I think also at that time the fact that Buddhism was to some degree kind of uncharted territory also gave a certain impetus to the spirit of adventure. I mean, a lot of us felt that we were really going into an unknown. The books that were available on Buddhism, say in the late 1960s, were very, very few and far between. It was difficult to get any clear picture of what Buddhism was about. And here we suddenly had the time, the money, the opportunity, the idealism, the longing to do such a thing, and we took that on board. In a more pragmatic sense, I became a monk because I realized it provided me with a way of life that, by its very nature, immediately took out of the equation any possibility of having a romantic involvement, getting married, having kids, having a career. All of that stuff was sort of cut short by the simple act of taking on Buddhist monastic vows. And having taken such vows, that meant that your life was designed from then on to focus exclusively on Buddhist philosophy and practice and doctrine and so on. And since that's what I wanted to do, and since I had all those other conditions in place, it was quite a natural step, really. I didn't think of it at the time as being particularly exceptional or remarkable, although obviously for many of my family back in Britain, that's not quite how they saw it. And I think nowadays it's true, the situation has changed. If I'd wanted to study Buddhism in Europe in the 1970s, it would have been virtually impossible, except perhaps in a university setting. There were no monasteries, no training centers, which nowadays we have many in Europe and America. There's not really any need to go out to the East. Many of the great Tibetan teachers are now either living in or come regularly to the West. Same with the Zen teachers. We now have a generation of Western teachers who have had as much training as most of the Asians that we might want to study with. So the situation has changed enormously since my time. So that I think is the main reason. And I think it's true. I'm not alone in this, obviously. There are many of my friends and colleagues who took a very similar step at a very similar time. And it's on the basis of that sort of commitment that we made that much of Buddhism in the West today is now doing as well as it is, I think, because we kind of created a foundational community of peers who had given our lives over to this rather eccentric way of life. And now we can see, with some satisfaction that has somehow brought something new into our culture that I think is of benefit and of good.
There are several moments in the story that you've written in the book of your years as a monk in various traditions that you turn aside to the reader and do say you had moments where you felt as if you were not or couldn't be as doctrinaire as some of the other monks were. Was that a feeling that you felt from the start, or did that only develop through the years?
Oh, it developed. It developed. It's very difficult with this distance in years to be able to say exactly how I thought or felt when I was 22 years old. I don't want to be presumptuous to assume that I can do that. Certainly in my first years as a Buddhist monk particularly, I was a very devout young man, and I was probably not dissimilar from a young person who would become a seminarian in a Catholic monastery, say, or something like that. And I took it all very seriously. And of course I had doubts, and my teachers were not naive enough to realize that I wouldn't, have such doubts. That was an entirely natural thing. But I think for the first years, probably the first 4 or 5 years, in spite of whatever doubts I might have had, I probably had a far greater confidence that I would be able to resolve them. I think the difficulty for me began when, having applied the various arguments and various doctrinal studies that I'd been instructed to pursue in order to quell these doubts, did not in the end turn out to be terribly convincing. And so it was really then that I started really having to take some of those doubts a lot more seriously. That the Buddhist tradition too, despite its claims to be rational and reasonable and scientific and so on, does of course rest to some degree on unquestioned dogmas, particularly in the Indo-Tibetan traditions, the dogmas of karma and rebirth. The problem is that, that's kind of what I was not looking for in Buddhism. Buddhism, in a sense, has been very successful in its own propaganda, in its own public relations with the West, in presenting itself as a tradition that doesn't seem to suffer from the standard problems we are likely to find in other religions. But I don't think that's true. I think Buddhism has pretty much exactly the same theological difficulties, if we can call them that. It has issues of authority and hierarchy, which are not much different from what we find in other theistic religious traditions. In fact, many of the things that one might find difficult about religion, you will in the end bump up against rather brutally in Buddhism itself.
It was one of the most fascinating parts of the book, I thought, where you talk about being a Tibetan monk and how you are urged to question everything you're being told. But then it turns out that's more in word than in deed. It's not actually meant so much. What's going on there with the professed necessity to question Buddhist teachings, when in reality perhaps that's not so much the case with organized branches of Buddhism?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than that. You see, I don't believe. I mean, if we take that as you've just described it, it would suggest that the Tibetan lamas are somehow not being sincere or honest. They're just sort of saying you should question things just out of habit or something. No, I think they're very sincerely suggesting that these teachings do stand up to the rigor of argument. The difference is that they're willing to accept arguments to demonstrate the truth of their beliefs that I did not find convincing. I think they really do believe that these arguments are valid. But the problem is there are certain assumptions built into the proof that you have to take on trust, or I felt you had to take on trust, that I couldn't. So in some senses, I think what I experienced was a conflict of cultures, that the sort of Socratic idea of simply test it and don't give up until you've really picked an issue to bits, and don't accept something as true unless you can really be quite certain about that, does not fit with a more religious approach, which says that, yes, reason is very important. We need to analyze and question these things. But at the same time, we're Buddhists or Christians or whatever, and our inquiry is based on a certain faith, a certain trust in Jesus or in Buddha or in Muhammad. And our reason in that sense will fall short, perhaps, of what the founders of the tradition have presented to us. So I couldn't take it in that way. In some ways, I discovered that in many respects, I was a product of the European Enlightenment. I was a rationalist, an empiricist. I hadn't really thought of myself in that way. But when I reached a crisis with some of my Buddhist doctrines, it became rather clear that that was my default position. I got to a point where I wasn't willing to relinquish that. I wasn't willing to give that up in favor of returning to what seemed to me a rather superstitious, almost, set of beliefs and convictions.
There is a very interesting illustrative example you use in the book where you talk about saying and on some level believing that a monk was able to shield you from the rain, but then at the same time you knew on a certain level you didn't believe that in the way maybe belief is normally conceived of. What was going on there mentally with something like that?
Well, it's that's the image in which with which I opened the book. The reason that image was so compelling to me, and I hadn't, it had always been in my mind, that little episode about the rainmaker, or the rain stopper in this case. I think that was one of the first moments where I noticed a split within myself, where there was a part of me that had a great yearning to believe in what these Tibetan teachers taught. I desperately wanted to believe that. I had a craving to come to some certainty that this was in fact the way the world worked. And yet, simultaneously with that longing, was also a kind of skepticism, which I'm sure was really part of my own Western upbringing. A skepticism which was, always standing back and saying, well, actually, what is going on here? And I think what was, in a sense, quite fascinating for me to observe, and again, possibly through having done Buddhist meditations and so on, that gave me a certain clarity in my introspections. I don't know. But in any case, I could start to see that my mind was riven in different directions, that there were certain areas of commonality. In Buddhism was certainly saying, check things out, look carefully at what's actually happening, don't believe something, which of course you could hear likewise in a modern Western education. But at the same time, Buddhism introduced a kind of factor X and expected me to believe things that I really balked at, like how Tibetan lamas might be able to stop the rain. And I could see, in that moment, both of parts of my mind claiming some kind of validity. I wanted to believe in the Lama, and hence I was willing to lie, in fact, and report to others things that I hadn't observed, but I felt that I should have done and needed to in order to maintain my belief in the Lama's prowess. And yet at that same time, a kind of uncomfortable recognition that I was not being entirely sincere with myself. And I think that set up a tension that I didn't really resolve until many years later, probably not for another 10 or so years. But it was useful, I think, that I could bear in mind episodes such as those where I saw quite clearly the conflicts within my own mind.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. You can hear this show again or any other in the official Marketplace of Ideas interview archive at our website, colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Buddhist educator, scholar, and author Stephen Batchelor, whose new book is Confession of a Buddhist Atheist. Now, back to the conversation. And this is what I'm quite interested in, the thread in the story where it seems like I've heard from former Buddhists, they say that they had these moments and that led them to abandon Buddhism, but that was not the case in your story. It was to try other forms of it, to keep within Buddhism, but to adjust the sort of Buddhism you were using, the kind of Buddhism you were living. Now, why? First of all, were there ever any moments when you thought Buddhism itself might not be for you anymore? Because it always seems like Buddhism was always going to be there. You just had to find the right Buddhism.
That's a good observation, and I think it's true. I mean, for some reason, and I can't really put my finger on it, we are here, I think, going into something rather irrational. I do have a rather intuitive trust and faith, I suppose, in the Buddhist tradition. And I suppose particularly, and this becomes clearer as the book continues, particularly in the original, what appear to be the original ideas of the historical Buddha. And I think I'd been introduced to those even when I was with Tibetan and Zen teachers, and many books on Buddhism I'd read talked of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and so on. And all the other Buddhist traditions, the Tibetans and others likewise affirm those primary values. So I never really had any difficulties with the primary moral and ethical position of Buddhism. I never had any difficulties with the basic practices of contemplation and meditation. I never had any difficulties with some of the most important philosophical ideas. So in other words, the core, which I think most Buddhists would agree lies at the heart of their faith, has never really been an issue for me. The problem has been in my willingness or inability in many cases to accept particular bodies of orthodoxy, which I think I recognized quite early on. It's not that remarkable an insight, I feel, that Tibetan Buddhism was clearly something designed for Tibetan people. It was not the same as Japanese Buddhism or Burmese Buddhism, even superficially. It looks completely different. It has different texts. It has different beliefs. It has different practices. It has different systems of authority. So as a Westerner, it becomes, I think, fairly self-evident that there is no such thing as Buddhism. There are many variations of a particular theme, which all the traditions hold in common, the basic doctrines and philosophies and meditations, and yet these have manifested historically in a very culturally specific traditions. Even when I was very young, I could see that. And I think what I was always seeking was not to get overly embroiled in the intricacies of Tibetan culture or Korean culture or Japanese culture. I recognized that these were simply, in a sense, sort of rather superficial forms that Buddhism had assumed. And in that regard, my struggle was not with the core doctrine, what I think is fair to say are the core ideas of Buddhism, but with certain elements of it that seem to be rather more cultural accretions. Now, of course, the big point of dispute here with many of my co-Buddhists will be the doctrine of reincarnation, because they will say, look, this is something that goes right back to the historical Buddha. Much of Buddhism simply doesn't make sense without the doctrine of reincarnation. You can't abandon that. But I disagree. I think that Indian culture likewise colors Buddhism as much as does Tibetan, Korean, Japanese, etc. Except the Indian culture is so much more rooted in the very origins of Buddhism that it's more difficult for us to see that. But my own sense is the doctrine of reincarnation, the doctrine of karma, and even the doctrine of liberation, of freedom from the cycle of birth and death, which is a similar goal that you'll find in Hinduism, that these are actually elements of Indian culture. And I think there are passages, admittedly not many, but certain passages in the early texts which suggest that the Buddha too had certain reservations about those Indian ideas and sought, in fact, to come up with something really rather different as a response to the kind of radically changing world in which he was born in North India in the 5th century BC.
Now, woven in with your story in this book is, of course, the story of the Buddha, the story of Gautama. And what set you on this quest to find out the story of this actual man, the one that a lot of Buddhists don't seem to be all that interested in, surprisingly so?
Well, it's interesting that you say surprisingly so. It's only surprising, I think, because we are coming from a Western culture and we are so familiar with the biblical literature, which is always, or not always, but so dominantly phrased in terms of certain teachers' lives. I mean, the narrative power of teaching we find right from the stories of Abraham and Isaac right through to Jesus of the Gospels. And we're so used, in a sense, to having our religious or our spiritual values communicated and embodied in the lives of the founders, that we find it odd, puzzling, that Buddhists seem entirely indifferent and rather, I think, rather shockingly uninformed by our standards of the life of their own founder. So I think at one level, this has been something that's always puzzled me, and something that I've always sought to gain more insight into, namely, the historicity of and the character of this human person. And I think in Asia, in fact, the Buddha in some ways wasn't even really considered to be human. That might sound strange, but just look at the Buddha image that is so ubiquitous nowadays. This is not a picture, this is not a human being. This person with this strange lump on top of his head and all other rather strange characteristics is a kind of quasi, sort of a God-man kind of figure. It's a very curious image that Buddhists have of their founder. And similarly, I think it reflects a fact that they see the Buddha really as someone who's almost come from another world, another level of experience so different from ours, that he can only be adequately represented as a sort of mythic being, even though he does appear on this earth. And yet the Pali Canon in particular, and there are traces of this also through all of the monastic texts that different Buddhist traditions all adhere to, show him or give glimpses of him as a very vulnerable human person, someone who lived at a quite specific place and time, who has dealings with other human persons, some of whom are not very pleasant, and has to struggle throughout most of his career to achieve his, the security of his community, have access to sufficient wealth whereby he can teach and he can develop his doctrine and so on. And this leads one, I think, inevitably into an increasing fascination with the humanity of this man. What triggered my actual research, which really began in about 2003, when it really started to take off, was going on a pilgrimage with a friend of mine in North India and visiting the places where the Buddha lived and worked. And for the first time, gaining a very vivid sense of the geography of the Buddha's times, of knowing where these different places I'd read about in the texts were actually located, knowing the distances between them, having a much more vivid sense of the landscape, of the flora, of the different trees and insects and birds and animals and farming traditions and so forth and so on. All of this suddenly began to flesh out this figure in a way that was rather startling. And so on returning from that pilgrimage, I began to make a much more in-depth inquiry into trying to piece together the life of the Buddha, what actually he did from the moment of his enlightenment until his death. It's that part of the Buddha's story that is the least well known. We all know the story of his renunciation, of his becoming enlightened, of his starting to teach, and then his dying 45 years later in Kushinagar. That is well accepted by all Buddhists, but there are enormous gaps in that story. And unfortunately, the Pali materials do not present this data to us in any kind of chronological sequence. So part of my task was really to figure out in what order these events that are reported in the canon did in fact take place.
I get the impression from the book that in shaping this view of Buddhism you have, this interpretation of Buddhism, the Pali Canon, of course, is very important, but also the writings of this Englishman whose name I will certainly mispronounce, Nanavira Theta. First of all, am I correct in the impression that those two are the planks of the Buddhism you explain yourself as holding in this book?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite correct in saying that for me, the only authentic canonical texts for me are those preserved in what are called the Sutta Pitaka and the Vinaya Pitaka of the Pali Canon. In other words, the text recorded in Pali, the Pali language, that recount the discourses the Buddha gave, and also the instructions he gave to his monks in their monastic training. And that is a view that I share with Jnanavira Thera, who is an Englishman who lived in Sri Lanka from about 1948 to 1965 as a Buddhist monk, and went very deeply, I think, into his not only his study of, but a very critical analysis of the Pali tradition. And many of his insights I found to be very helpful in developing my own understanding of what the Buddha taught. Now, there are certain things that I don't agree with Jnana-Viratera. I think he had perhaps an even pathologically negative regard to the world, which I found quite distasteful. But again, it does pick up on a thread that is there in the Buddhist tradition. You can't deny that. And also, Jnana-Viratera was willing to put aside the traditional Buddhist commentarial traditions, which I do agree can often tend to obscure as much as they illuminate, and give rise to sort of orthodox beliefs which you find subsequently the Buddha never actually enunciated. But Jnana-Vira is unwilling to question certain doctrines like that of rebirth and others, which he feels are non-negotiable, basically. So what Jnana-Viratera, in a sense, introduced me to was a much better way of looking at the Pali Canon. He gave me the sort of permission, in a sense, to put aside orthodox commentarial interpretations of that tradition. And he also embodied in his life, in a very extreme way in some senses, a radical practice of this tradition. And so, yes, I did find that Jnana-Viratera was a great help, was a great guide, was a great kind of role model in a way, an example of someone who wasn't brought up as a Buddhist, but who took it on very seriously and ultimately gave his life to it. So yes, that was a key thing. But also another key was my introduction to the meditation practice called Vipassana, which I first came across in India when I was, I think, only 21 or 22 years old, just after I became a Buddhist monk in the Tibetan tradition. And I did a 10-day Vipassana retreat with a man called Mr. Goenka. And this was, to me, one of the greatest eye-openers that I experienced in my training, was a form of meditation that even after a relatively short period of practicing it, in this case about 10 days, very palpable effects were produced. And that's not something I'd experienced after my years with Tibetan teachers. A direct experience in terms of a transformation of our actual consciousness of the here and now were not a part of my Tibetan practice, nor were they ever really thought of as things that one should expect. But with Mr. Goenka, I found a very effective practice based in the Pali tradition, the text of the Pali Canon. And I think it's the two, really. It's the practice of Vipassana and that very basic act of mindful attention to the here and now, together with the critical attitude of Jnana-Vira, on the basis of this enormous and I think extraordinarily impressive body of canonical materials found in the Pali Canon, that have probably guided me to the sort of view that I put forth in this book.
Now, I do hope you'll forgive me for how grand this question is going to sound, but whether we're talking about Japanese or Korean or Indian or Tibetan Buddhism, whether we're talking about the Buddhism you experienced in your early 20s or the Buddhism you experience now, what is at this central core that has remained so appealing to you? What is it that drew you in then as much as it keeps you there now, despite all of the fluctuations in sort of doctrinal debates and all of the differences in administration and structure of the various types of Buddhism you've encountered? What has been unshakable, I guess I'll put it?
Unshakable suggests something that doesn't move, and so I'm not too drawn to that particular metaphor.
Well then forget unshakable. You use whatever word you'd like.
I know what you mean. I think it's because these practices and these ideas have enabled my life to flourish in a very particular way. I found that by reflecting and meditating upon ideas such as impermanence, on suffering, or contingency, of emptiness, by trying to live my life according to the basic norms of Buddhist ethics, by organizing my ideas, my worldview on the ideas of Buddhist philosophy. This has, I found, provided a very rich and very liberating framework in which to live my life. It's given me, I think, a great deal of courage over the years to follow my own intuitions, to not be beholden to the orthodoxies of religious belief or to the opinions of others. And it's given me a confidence that is based not just on a kind of blind faith, but on something that I hope is more deeply rooted in my own personal experience. It has led me also into a life that's been quite rich imaginatively and creatively. I find that my good fortune in being able to write and publish Buddhist books has been a very key part of my own practice. It's provided me with an avenue whereby to develop certain writerly skills, certain artistic longings, certain imaginative tasks, and all of that holding together in what seems to me an entirely coherent way. So I think it's the coherence and the constancy of certain ideas and practices that have served me well in so many different phases and moments in my life that have perhaps made my commitment to this tradition less and less shakeable, if you want to put it like that. But I'd be reluctant to sort of isolate any one thing, because I don't think that I think is part of the problem. It's far more convenient to say, yes, the essence of Buddhism is this teaching or this practice. I don't think Buddhism has an essence in that sense, any more than human life has an essence. And Buddhism has taught me to be very suspicious of essences, of things that somehow reside at the core of life, and to recognize far more that both Buddhist teaching and Buddhist practice lead you into a much more fluid relationship with the ongoing processes of being human. This emphasis on impermanence, for example, makes it very difficult to sort of pin down something as being lasting or somehow intrinsically true or absolutely valid. All of such ideas are dubious. And it's really this idea of participating in a flow or a current or a stream of experience that is what matters, and what in the end, I think, is the most fulfilling and the most satisfying aspect of such a way of life. And that is also a process of ongoing discovery, of ongoing inquiry. I don't feel that I've reached the end of questioning at all. In fact, as my practice continues, I feel that my questioning, my sense of the sheer strangeness and mysteriousness of life only increases. It only continues to grow. And I don't know where it will lead. Every book I write, in a way, is a kind of just a description of a particular point in a much longer journey that I'm continually playing itself out in my life. And so, there may be moments in the future that I will experience great doubt or disappointment or disillusion. I don't know. But as long as the practice and the ideas and so forth, and my ability to, in a sense, work within this field continue, that I think is what reinforces and grounds my faith, if you wish, in the Buddhist tradition.
The book, once again, is Confession of a Buddhist Atheist. Stephen Batchelor, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
It's been a pleasure, Colin. I enjoyed talking with you, and I hope our listeners enjoy this discussion and might even consider buying the book. Thank you very much.
If you'd like more information about Stephen Batchelor and Confession of a Buddhist Atheist, visit stephenbatchelor.org. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. You can hear this show again or any other in the Marketplace of Ideas interview history on the official archive at our website, colinmarshallradio.com. The website of the man who makes our theme music, Ben Althouse, is also available at benalthouse.com. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you next time.